Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to episode 7 of Perspectives on Sustainability. I'm your host, Chris Whitehead, and we're doing this one today as a follow-up on our last episode that got frankly contentious at times. So, in no particular order here, first we have Eric Beightel, Federal Strategy Director from Environmental Science Associates. Afternoon, Eric. How are you?
I'm well. How are you, Chris?
Not too shabby, not too shabby. And next we have Josh Kaplowitz, Senior Counsel from Troutman Pepper and Locke. Josh, how you doing?
Good, good. I missed the analogy. We'll have to you'll have to explain it to me afterwards.
I will send you an episode.
Okay.
Yeah, very quickly, if you guys just want to give a quick bio and also how you got into looking into renewables developments and what is if there's anything in particular you're looking forward to addressing actually today. And Josh, Eric, whoever wants to go first.
I'm happy to go first. So, really appreciate the opportunity to come on the show, Chris. My background is in the permitting and policy side of this. So, the legal and policy ramifications. I take the policy side. We'll let Josh cover the legal side. I most recently I served as the executive director of the Federal Permitting Council in the Biden administration, so appointed by President Biden in July of 2023, and served through the end of the term. And through that role, we obviously had a large part to play in the administration's efforts to accelerate the deployment of renewable energy and accelerate our transition to a clean energy economy. So I was responsible for overseeing almost all of the Atlantic offshore wind projects. There was only one of the Atlantic offshore wind that was not part of our portfolio at the Permitting Council. We also had a number of solar projects and onshore terrestrial wind, as well as hydro, and had some interest in geothermal as well from developers. So we had, we cover all the various aspects of renewable energy, and so that experience serving as the executive director of the Permitting Council and having those conversations with the developers as they ran into hurdles or challenges in the permitting review of their projects really provided a perspective that I hadn't had as much of before. So taking that forward into my role here at Environmental Science Associates is really just providing some federal strategy to developers as they try to figure out how to navigate, as you mentioned, as a very rapidly changing policy framework and regulatory climate, and how we can be successful in spite of what appear to be pretty significant headwinds.
I think that's probably an understatement, but again, I definitely appreciate you joining here today. Josh?
Yeah. So first off, thanks for having me. I come at this from a legal policy hybrid angle. I've been doing renewable energy and really all types of permitting work really for the last 13 years. But my sort of primary experience in the space is the 5 years I spent at the Department of Interior at the solicitor's office as legal counsel to the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management's offshore wind program from 2015 to 2020, straddling the Obama and first Trump administrations. And then I spent 2 years at American Clean Power as their vice president for offshore wind and engaged with Eric and really the whole spectrum of folks in the federal government, both career and politicals, with a particular focus on offshore wind. I'm now in the private sector working with clients on permitting both offshore wind and other types of renewable and carbon-free forms of energy, although I have done when I was at Interior, I did some oil and gas work as well. So I have experience across the whole energy permitting spectrum, and I'm really looking forward to this vital conversation.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that. And just a little bit of background for everybody, as I put these episodes together and try to pair up experts, I always also kind of ask, oh, do you happen to know this person? And when I did that this time, I'm thinking in the back of my head, yeah, I'm almost positive they do. But then I found out they really do, and have been working together off and on for a number of years. So I had to kind of laugh at that. But I'm just going to jump into it, guys. According to President Trump on his first day of office, we are in a national energy emergency. So logically, you would think that would open things up for developing renewables, and there'd be concrete steps taken after this to bring more energy online and address some of the constraints that we talked about in the last episode. Does the EO do any of that?
Um, I can take a first crack at that. I mean, it's really kind of, you're asking two questions, right? Are we in an energy emergency from a legal perspective and from a sort of factual perspective? And those two questions are related but distinct. You know, I'll take the legal view since I am a lawyer here. You know, there's the National Emergencies Act is the sort of the statute that sort of sets the general parameters in terms of what constitutes an emergency and what authorities that declaration triggers. And this is an unusual emergency. Usually emergencies are tethered to, or emergency declarations, at least historically, have been tethered to one very specific event. The Deepwater Horizon oil spill, a hurricane, other forms of extreme weather, Superstorm Sandy. This is tied to a sort of general kind of very broad-based sort of area of policy. And so, it'll be very interesting to see whether this declaration is upheld in court, just to get right to the point. There were it was controversial at the start, and, in terms of just people's reactions to it and the general unprecedented nature of it. And, very recently, 15 states filed suit in the Western District of Washington, challenging this. And they basically made the case that this is, well outside the norm of like what is typically an energy emergency. They pointed out, and Eric, I'm sure you can get into this more, that like there's some inconsistencies between the high level declaration of an emergency and some of the sort of steps that have been taken, adjacent to this to implement that. Is it an emergency when you are also trying to undermine other sources of energy? It raises some questions. And then, there are sort of knock-on questions about whether the legal authorities being triggered, particularly with the Army Corps of Engineers, are appropriate under this declaration. So there are some genuine legal questions, and I expect that they're going to get resolved at the highest level of the courts. It's probably going to go to the Supreme Court, regardless of what the district court does here. So that's a little bit of a hybrid answer, but that's my initial reaction.
No, I think that's a good spot to start because honestly is a very fair point here that it might not go forward. And just my own opinion here, there seems to be a lot of federal actions the last few months that they're trying to test boundaries as to what the constraints will be going forward, and pushed a lot of this stuff up to SCOTUS for the final answer. So they're going to be earning overtime, I think, over the next couple of months. But on that, Eric, do you have anything to follow up with?
Yeah, I think it's important, as Josh mentioned, the energy emergency, it does seem to favor certain technologies over others. It is explicit, or it does not include, I guess it doesn't explicitly exclude, but it does not include in its very defined list of eligible energy sources anything to do with solar, offshore, or terrestrial wind. It does allow for geothermal, but other types of renewable energy are not captured in the energy emergency. And so, if you have, logic would dictate that if you have an emergency, then it should be, the famous all of the above strategy, because you need to generate as much as possible. But that does not seem to be the case here. So that undermines a little bit of their argument about the emergency. I think also, just to build on a little bit of what Josh said, the SCOTUS is going to obviously weigh in and make the final determination here. But I was actually anticipating that some of the core permits would probably go forward. But when Department of Interior issued their emergency procedures under NEPA for this emergency declaration that had 14 days to do an environmental assessment with no public comment. You would just merely post the EA to make it available once it was done and you had a finding of no significant impact, or a 28-day term for the EIS, environmental impact statement. That just on its face was like, you are not serious. You can't be seriously thinking that you're going to complete a robust NEPA analysis for something that by its very nature has been determined to have significant environmental effects in that sort of a truncated period. But lo and behold, last week, Department of Interior found the first willing mine to undertake the environmental assessment provision. So there's a Utah mine that's going to do an EA in 14 days. I would have thought that the industry would have been a little bit more reluctant to jump on this because of the inherent legal risk. I mean, we are really in uncharted territories here. And if you want this to move fast, doing it in this sort of a truncated fashion and then dealing with the litigation afterwards that ultimately may force you to go back and do it all over again seems like a risky bet. But here we are. I mean, to be fair, the Utah, I think it's a uranium mine, the Utah mine, it was already in it was in operation. It had been closed. They were updating the plan of operations. Like it may be something that does not have significant effect, and that's great. But still, this sort of a truncated period where you are going clearly outside the bounds of what historically has been done for an environmental assessment is going to create, some pretty immediate legal challenges, I would think. The ACHP has their emergency procedures to essentially bypass a lot of the consultation requirements in order to meet the timeline. And that also, when you have tribal interests or other entities with very strong cultural ties to an area that's being affected by these projects, just circumventing that because of the emergency declaration really, I mean, it undermines public trust. It also reduces the benefit of that consultation to improve the definition of the project. And I think it also sets a precedent, and I think we're going to get into this a little bit later, but like, if you do an emergency declaration and you circumvent all of the routine actions, without a doubt, some of our routine actions need to be revisited, but just kicking them to the curb and charging ahead, it sets a very dangerous might be an overstatement, but I think it might fit here. A precedent into like anybody could declare an emergency on anything, and then we'll just charge ahead. And I think that we want to be careful with that. It is time for us to revisit kind of some of our long-held beliefs and understandings of the process, but I don't know that this is quite the way that we want to go about it.
But that said, I mean, I'm going to be watching with great interest, and I think a lot of renewable energy developers are, and advocates in this space about what is the court going to say? Because if all of a sudden you live in a world where emergency declarations can be sort of policy based and not sort of event based, why wouldn't you avail yourself of those of these sort of streamlined processes if you're trying to achieve faster permitting processes? I mean, emergencies are, we've seen examples, I guess, recently of emergencies that have streamlined permitting processes in a very sort of politically popular way. I mean, the example that pops to mind is, Governor Shapiro in Pennsylvania was faced with a highway overpass that had just been blown up by a truck exploding, and experts were saying it could take months and months to rebuild this, following the usual processes. He declared an emergency. He brought all these resources to bear, that a lot of which happened to be kind of in the area, and I think it was they rebuilt this overpass in 2 weeks.
I could drive over it every day almost.
Right. I mean, that's an extreme example for sure, but I think it speaks to this notion that there's an appetite within the public for, powering ahead and using government resources to get stuff done and not get bogged down with red tape. I think if I were sort of king of the permitting world, I would say, look at these tools to the extent they present themselves and take advantage of them, but in a measured, careful way that, Eric, to your, very good point, doesn't blow up in your face with legal risk that ends up making the whole process take even longer. and there's certainly a lot to be said for not alienating key key stakeholders, because that can blow up in your face as well, even if the the lawsuits don't materialize or prevail.
Or maybe said another way also, Josh, can it be a national emergency for something that's so multifaceted? To address this, you have to address the grid, you have to address various types of energy sources. It's not, as you say, just one constraint, small window, single event thing. There's huge, huge investment, large amounts of time, and essentially just ripping up and starting over for a lot of federal regulation. So that kind of actually feels like a lot to fit into one small small window there. But on that point, we started talking about that a little bit briefly before. And Eric, I know this is one of your big issues over the last few years, and it came up a lot in the last episode with Doug and Mark. Permit streamlining, and also the need that if we're going to be doing this and bringing large scale projects online, ideally we have to find a way to do it faster. So if you could talk about what's been done to date and anything you possibly wish you could have done differently over the last couple years at FIPSI.
Yeah, I'm sorry that we only have an hour, because I think we could go on for quite some time about some things that I wish we could have gotten done, or things that maybe we would have done a little bit differently. But permitting efficiency, permitting streamlining, permitting acceleration, whatever you want to call it, is historically very much a bipartisan thing. Every presidential administration, going back to Jimmy Carter, has looked at ways to try and accelerate permitting somehow to get infrastructure built. Everybody recognizes that it takes a little bit too long. The issues that they faced back in the Reagan and Carter years are much different than the issues that we face now, but it has always been a recognition that we need to get federal dollars out the door to invest in this infrastructure to build a competitive economy. So, we have tackled this from a variety of different ways. And historically, it has always been around the margins. My background, I spent a little over 8 years at the Department of Transportation, and DOT, the transportation projects in particular, have really benefited from that bipartisan focus on accelerating permitting. Many of the transportation reauthorization bills have language in there that changes the way that you do NEPA and permitting for transportation projects, because everybody recognizes you need to have a functioning transportation system in order to move people, goods, and services. We don't have that same benefit to our energy infrastructure. It has not. We don't have, even though we have a Department of Energy, we don't have. They are not necessarily in charge of all of the energy things. We've got FERC. We've got federal lands where these projects are occurring that have special use permits. You've got in it maybe not even it's a non-federal entity if it's on private land. And so, as we've tried to translate the lessons of transportation into these other infrastructure sectors, which is ultimately what the Fast 41 process and the Permitting Council was taking a lot of the lessons that we had learned in transportation and trying to apply it to infrastructure projects writ large. It's clear that what works really well for transportation doesn't necessarily work as well for other infrastructure because of the federalized system. You have an inherent planning process that is defined in regulation and statute that requires this early engagement with the communities to define a project, and then you move into a NEPA analysis of an actual project. And that same structure doesn't exist in our energy landscape at the same scale. And so you have many different entities who are advancing these projects at different levels, levels of design, levels of definition for impacts, and just information availability, that made it hard for us to tackle the streamlining the same way. So what we did instead was, like with Fast 41, really encouraging projects to come forward to build a permitting timetable, hold the agencies accountable to that, but without a clear decision maker in that process. The Permitting Council is, I firmly believe in it. Obviously, serving as the executive director, I find the mission of the agency to be very critical, but they are also not equipped fully with the authority that is necessary to break the log jams that inevitably occur with these projects. I mentioned earlier on the Francis Scott Key Bridge example, that was the even to have the debate on whether or not this should be a categorical exclusion or an environmental assessment when you've lost this critical artery in the Baltimore region, just shows the reluctance on the part of Democrats and progressives of taking a much more aggressive stance in this space. And that is something that we were constantly challenged with, I think, during the Biden years of, well, if we do it this way and we are able to accomplish, these goals to deploy more clean energy infrastructure, who's to say that the next administration is not going to come in and use these exact same tools to advance their types of projects? And my response is, well, they might, and that's a risk we have to take. But by not doing anything, we have found ourselves where we are today, where you have an administration that is actively deconstructing the entire permitting structure that we have built over the past 50 years. And that, is producing a lot of unintended consequences, a lot of uncertainty that's, obviously affecting the market as well. And I think that is where it's not just what we didn't get done, it's our inability to just think critically about like what is the realm of the possible and what can we do to accomplish our goals. Let's not be so hung up on like, well, what if the other guys take it and they do it, they have ill intent. In order for us to accomplish our goals, that's a risk I think we sometimes have to take.
Well, and here we are. We were afraid of
Right.
our shadows, and sure enough, they did what they wanted to do anyway.
Yeah.
It's I agree with all, I agree with all that. I experienced that, from the outside, sort of advocating for the offshore wind industry. I mean, I can put a little more color on this from just, specifically from the offshore wind perspective. At the beginning, the Biden administration came out with this 30 gigawatt by 2030 goal. And when American Clean Power went in to, ask, sort of bring in like a slate of policies on permitting, on vessels, on really a wide range of different issues to say, hey, here's what the industry needs to implement this. What needs from you, the federal government, the Biden administration, to implement this goal. The answer we got was, what are you coming to us for? We gave you the goal. What else do you need? Like, you're the businesses, you're the developers, get it done. And that sort of imperious sort of attitude didn't help. Like, it's good to set goals and sort of set those high level expectations, but you have to roll up your sleeves and do the hard work to turn those goals into reality and figure out what are the bottlenecks that might prevent those goals from happening. And just all too often we saw an unwillingness to sort of break through those bottlenecks. I mean, I'll call out at least one agency. NOAA Fisheries. They're one of the services tasked with Fish and Wildlife, along with Fish and Wildlife, with tasking with implementing our species related statutes, Endangered Species Act, Marine Mammal Protection Act. One is a consultation with the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, who's the kind of the lead agency, but one is a separate and distinct permit. So, Eric, to your point about the sort of, or the implied point about the lack of one-stop shopping and the need to get agencies to play nicely, you had some folks, career folks at NOAA who were really kind of looking. It became very apparent, and it was apparent when I was at the solicitor's office as well, that they were just looking for barriers to throw in. Did not like offshore wind, individuals that just didn't like offshore wind, and were just kind of looking for problems to insert into the process, sand to put in the gears. And we sort of begged, the White House and other kind of coordinate BOEM and other kind of coordinating entities to kind of lean on NOAA to be more cooperative. And there was a fear of doing that, and as a result, you had a lot of projects that got delayed by a year or more, and those things have consequences. You have projects that could have been either under construction or completed, but because they got delayed, now they're either not permitted or they have permits that are several years off of construction. And when you leave things hanging, and then you have a sort of major pendulum swing on the policy level, you leave evidently leave projects quite vulnerable. So, you know, this hesitation to, you know, use your authority, and there was no legal reason stopping the White House, stopping agencies from sort of forcing issues and forcing, you know, alignment with policy goals. It was just really a kind of a fear of oh, if we do this, there will be some blowback either now or in the future. And again, very real world consequences, gigawatts of clean electrons not going on the grid today because of this.
No, I was gonna say, makes me think of the stranded capacity issues too, and what's needed to build out transmission. I don't want to go there just yet, but also, Josh, I was surprised, frankly, to see an already approved offshore wind permit be pulled back. I didn't see that one coming, but I guess I should have.
Oh man. I mean, I don't want to, we could talk for a whole nother episode just on that one situation.
Yeah.
It's pretty complicated. But you know, I think what it shows is just the, you know, I don't think it would have happened if Empire Wind had been permitted a year earlier than it was.
Yeah.
Which it could have been. It would have been mostly or completely under construction.
Josh raised a point that is worth, I think pulling out a little bit more in this, the idea that the NOAA staff are, whether they were personally objecting to the projects or, they firmly believe that the science supported their determination that the whales were going to be exterminated as a result of the development of these. And so their responsibility is to prolong the sustained survival of the whale. At some point, we have to be able to do trade-offs in a way that allows for us to say, yes, this statute says you must do at all costs protect, but it doesn't account for all the other things that we have to be considering here. And so I'm sorry, in this instance, we're gonna choose clean energy over the particular survival of this whale because of the greater good that it presents. And right now, our system, our permitting structure isn't designed in a way to allow for that to occur. There's not an ombudsman who can say, all right, well, Endangered Species Act applies or the Marine Mammal Protection Act applies up until this point, and in which case we're going to override it because we have, to use a CEQA term, overriding considerations of the effects of the benefits here. So we're going to move forward. That is something that we don't currently have, and it creates these conflicts with the statutes, which are historically, I think, were by design to ensure that we were taking these things into account to find the perfect project to thread the needle. But we are not in a situation now where we have multiple years to figure out how to thread that needle. And so now is an opportunity when they're blowing everything up, like, how do we rebuild this in a way that's meaningful? And I think trade-offs are factoring that into the decision-making process is going to be critical.
No, I agree. And couldn't agree with you more on the trade-offs. It is tough because, like, when you're in the thick of the process, you're trying to find solutions that fit within the regulations and the statutes that you have to stay within. And so you don't have the luxury of kind of taking a step up and trying to figure out some structural change. We have that luxury now because I'm not sure that a ton is happening, in the trenches for the next 3.5 or more years. But I will say, even in the trenches, we were out there pointing out that Endangered Species Act authority did not require these, project jeopardizing, to sort of misuse that word, but the mitigation measures, and that there is a way to. We were trying to point out to everyone on every level there were ways to comply with the statute that allowed these projects to happen in a much more expeditious fashion. But the trade-off really was about kind of this fear of overriding, these sort of career scientists and regulators, and what that might, what blowback that might happen. clearly this administration not so concerned about that. There is not and so I would submit that there's a middle ground between the approach of just running roughshod and basically trying to like sort of cut career expertise out of the mix and being completely and wholly deferential even when there are sort of reasonable countervailing considerations. And I think this whole discussion is about finding that middle path where we don't jettison our values of like, considering environmental effects, considering stakeholder impact, stakeholder input, while at the same time just not going so far in the other direction of just losing sight of the end objective here of getting these projects done and online.
Yeah, and I was just thinking as you were speaking there, Josh, about how certain red states throughout the country are actually pretty strong on localized renewables, like offshore wind, like solar. Obviously, some could go a much longer way. Um, but I wonder if the sort of trade-offs you were talking about before will also fuel the misinformation that we've seen over the last couple of years with offshore wind, as an example, again, with the whales, and just kind of lead us down another quagmire here, unless it's as well defined up front as we possibly can. It's kind of how I see it.
I mean, Erica, like the angle I would go with this, I mean, you're always going to have opponents to projects and you're always going to have misinformation. There's not a whole lot you can do to kind of, other than sort of in the communications realm, which is maybe a little bit out of scope of this discussion. Like that's but part of the problem is that when the misinformation turns into lawsuits, there's another place where there needs to be some middle ground where you don't take away the right to challenge projects, but you streamline and cabin that right. And I think that Fast 41, I mean, the statute that you were immersed in, started down that path, shortened statute of limitations, like had these requirements that you can only sue if you've been at the table and given notice to agencies that they have to that they have to have had the opportunity to take that input and respond to it. But I think you could go further. And I know this is kind of an unpopular position with some folks on the progressive side, but like, in Europe is full of liberal democracies that don't have this sort of door flung wide open, lawsuit happy approach. You can challenge projects, but that challenge has to be targeted and it ends very quickly. So it doesn't hold up financing, for example. Like the fear of lawsuits is can hold up financing and procurement to get projects online. And then it also has the knock-on effect of making agencies spend longer and it's one thing to dot every I and cross every T, but to have to do it 5 different times because you're worried that even the slightest misstep in your process or in the administrative record can blow up in your face and cause the entire permit to be vacated is a very scary proposition. And I've just seen firsthand that well-intentioned career regulators take much longer than they need to because they have this sort of almost crippling fear of their decision getting overturned in court.
Yeah, I am of the mind. I've been, I think, coalescing around this for a while, but my time at the Permitting Council really, I think, ingrained that I think NEPA needs to be less of a procedural statute and more outcome driven. And in that regard, when you are challenging a decision, you're challenging the decision on the outcome, not whether or not you effectively analyzed a random alternative that had no effect on the actual decision. Like there are many NEPA lawsuits they are by definition, they're procedural. They're suing under the Administrative Procedures Act. And that gets away from the intent here, which was to provide information sufficient for a decision maker to be able to make a decision on an action, an investment, a permit, whatever it might be. And I think if we are able to, again, go back to this, if they're going to burn it all down, how do we want to rebuild it? Like, let's rethink our relationship to NEPA and like, maybe it should be more outcome focused, and we don't require mitigation. We don't, there are lots of things in NEPA that have been glommed on over time that are not part of the core statute. And I don't support or align with a lot of the policy ideas that are coming out of this administration, but their return to the statute is maybe an opportunity for us to rethink what that means. And do we need to amend NEPA in order to get some of these outcomes that we have so long taken for granted embedded into the statute so that that drives the process to a decision, as opposed to all of the other things that go into it of, did you have sufficient notice and how many days was it available for public comment? And did you, like, all of those things that go into the process bog down the end result and open it up for so many opportunities for challenge. Whereas if we were really looking at, like, are we trying to produce better projects? I think that would have a much more substantive effect.
Yeah. No, I just go back to also how long it takes to do the quality environmental assessment, and then the amount of time you spend going back and forth with all parties involved, commenting, doing different versions of a document, and what should likely be, I don't know, 6, 8 months, 10 months, possibly a year, goes on and on and on, it stretches out. So I agree with everything that's been said today, and all for finding more efficient more efficient ways to get this stuff online, because we have to for 1,000 reasons. A thought just popped into my head as you were speaking there, Eric. I probably shouldn't say this because it's detrimental to my future employment down the line, potentially. But do you see a world where artificial intelligence could help actually process all this information? Because that's essentially what we're doing here, processing a ton of info as fast and efficiently as we possibly can.
Absolutely. And I mean, we're already into that world. When I was at the Permitting Council, we provided Department of Energy and Department of Interior both with several $1 million to leverage AI in the development of permitting strategies, whether it be public comment review and bucketing and preparing draft responses, or whether it's analyzing existing conditions in a project vicinity so that you can have kind of baseline conditions established so that you can do the impact analysis, drafting a purpose and need that you then, there's all kinds of things that AI could do to speed up the process. And if we can get some of the more administrative tasks done by automation and leave the human element for the actual analysis and the trade-offs and the consideration of all the things, I think that would make the process move more quickly. The question that ultimately is kind of existential here is how much of it is AI generating content that is not human vetted, human verified, and are you, when you challenge an AI created document, is that, ultimately it's the agency's responsibility, but how much trust are we willing to put on that? And how, if you have to read every word, are you really saving time? And so there's going to be a transition, but the use of AI to generate maps, to generate existing conditions, to just study all of the EISs that were done in the 100-mile radius or whatever, whatever you're looking at, is, I think that is a huge benefit to the overall industry because we'll produce better documents. We'll have a little bit more, it'll be more efficient. It's going to be a question of everyone's comfort in the content development as to whether or not, like, do I trust it? And that's just, I think, society as a whole getting comfortable with it.
Now, that also feels like something that should have, on some level anyway, bipartisan support and be more of an objective potential good if we do this right. So, Josh, I know you're going to jump in as well.
No, I mean, when ChatGPT made its big splash, I think back in like 2022, like one of the first things I did was call up a friend who did NEPA at Boehm, and I was like, "This is an incredible tool. Like, you could save months." And it's Eric, to your point, like, as long as a expert human is reviewing whatever sort of comes out of the engine and making sure that all the studies say what they're supposed to say, and it's still just a huge time saver on the front end. I mean, the same reason you would never, get ChatGPT to write a legal brief for you and then submit it to the court without like rigorously vetting it. There's
Except that did happen.
Oh yeah, no, there were some very funny stories that involved that, and I would not want anyone that I know in the NEPA world to be caught doing that. But as streamlining, it's one of many tools, right? It's not just going to be that; it's going to be figuring out better legal structures, making those trade-offs that Eric, that you were talking about. I mean, if there's one word that to take away from all this, is we got to make trade-offs. You can't have everything, right? And if these are good projects that we need to,
We'll stop there for a second, Josh. How do you exactly actually define what a good project is?
I mean, my personal definition is that climate change is the challenge of our times, and at least one litmus test is if it's a project that reduces greenhouse gas emissions, then it's should get a presumptive, streamlined path to permitting. But I'm also not going to exclude, oil and gas projects, wholesale either. I think I think that carbon capture and sequestration has to be part of the conversation here. And actually, just editorializing, you didn't ask the question, but like we have to figure out a way to stop this pendulum swing, where every administration just like imposes a completely polar opposite energy policy. And I mean, I worry a little bit about if Democrats say take office in 2029, there is going to be an appetite in some corners to sort of go full bore against the oil and gas industry and sort of wreak vengeance and do unto them what they seem to be doing unto us. And I would say I understand the impulse, but like let's figure out a kind of another solution that achieves the policy goals that we share, but it has a more sort of has an approach that kind of turns the temperature down, literally and figuratively, and that we figure out a way to kind of get more of what we need, without sort of, or while depolarizing the energy conversation. And maybe that's a naive thing to say, but I think we ought to at least be talking in that direction.
No, I agree. And it's a point of frustration for me, frankly, how the bipolarization and the lack of continuity at the federal level is kind of making things go fits and starts here. And it should be ideally some things we can objectively agree on. I said at the beginning that every large scale project has to focus on economic, environmental, and social impacts, but I think we'll all probably admit economic is always first and capitalized. But if you just drop off the other ones over time, that's also economic and public health issues. So we have to find the right way to do the trade-offs, have to find the right way to streamline all of this. How difficult is that though? Because we have a lot of entities involved here too. I forget who alluded to this before, but it's local, it's state, and federal. There are a lot of benefits to our system of government, but it's just also complicated and messy, especially for doing large-scale changes like this.
Yeah, it's extremely complicated, and it's not something that an administration can do on its own, at least shouldn't be doing on its own. I think that there's a role for Congress to play here to map out what our energy future looks like. And, their inaction for any number of reasons has resulted in where we are today. And we've touched on that already. But, the opportunities for local authorities, whether it be a county zoning or city planning or statewide entity, to throw up roadblocks for an interstate project that has much broader benefits than the very parochial interest of that one regulating body it's a big problem. We encounter solar projects across the country where you've got the conditions are perfect, but the county has issued a moratorium for 20 years on all renewable energy. Like, why on earth would you, like, there's so many benefits here. Why would you do that? But it's because of this, it's the narrative around these projects, and that if it's renewable, it's progressive and it's democratic and it's bad. And we have to be able to overcome that. So Congress has to be able to wrap their head around some sort of a energy policy that they can advance, that gives some discretion to the president on where they want to place their priorities, but that at least puts an equal playing field for the technologies in a way that they can be advanced without undermining one or the other and choosing winners and losers. There's always going to be this choosing a winner. That's what prioritization is. But the structure, the permitting structure for it should be consistent and, not favor one technology over the other. Everybody should have the opportunity to deploy. When it has regional benefit or interstate benefit, then it should be at a federal level. That's where the decision-making process should be. At least that's my perspective.
Yeah, I mean, and I think that a lot of the reforms we're talking about here at the federal level can be pushed down to the state level. I mean, Minnesota is a great example of a state that passed a pretty far-reaching, although my understanding is it didn't go quite as far as some proponents wanted, but a far-reaching permitting reform bill that really streamlined the process for wind and solar in particular. On the other end of the spectrum, you have Virginia. Virginia is a good example of a state that kind of, fits the mold that you're talking about. I think I read recently that there are like 55 jurisdictions within Virginia that have essentially the functional equivalent of local moratoria on solar, and yet you have all these data centers being built. I live in Northern Virginia. I have all these data centers being built in, not literally in my backyard, but quite close by. And if you're going to let localities, sort of cut off any ability to pair like solar and battery storage to electrify these data centers in a sustainable way, then your alternative is essentially gas plants or no no data centers and no ability to run the chat GPT that's going to be used to streamline the permitting process. See, it all comes full circle.
Full circle.
But yeah, so this isn't just a federal, shame on the federal government and for not getting the job done. It's states, it is localities. This movement towards the abundance of good things, clean energy, housing, transit, like all these things that we need more of, is a shared responsibility, and it can't just rest on one level of government in our wonderful federalist system.
I think that's a great transition, and just to start wrapping this up a little bit, we've been talking about challenges a lot to this point, and the still hard lift that this is going to be from a policy perspective for a lot of reasons. But can you guys both think, change it now to think forward for the next couple of years as to what you think is plausible for gains in renewables over, say, the next 3 to 4 years, and what is actually less likely to happen? Is there a certain aspect of this you think will do well? Is there a certain thing that probably isn't going to gain as much traction in the next couple of years? How do you want to handle that one?
I think the retreat of the federal government in leadership in this space is going to create a vacuum where some states are going to take on greater responsibility. I think we can all predict that California is going to be leaning in here, as well as probably a number of the Northeast states and others, where even Texas, which no one would ever confuse for a progressive state, but since the blackouts, and solar has become very popular in the state of Texas because it makes sense. We can generate all the power that we want, and states are going to lean in here. But if we don't do something with our transmission infrastructure, it's not going to do anybody any good. And I think that is where I know you asked for optimism and like what we think is possible. And I think there's a lot of possibility for power generation. I'm most concerned about the actual distribution of that power once it comes online. I mean, once even to get online. And that is where there's still a lot of work to be done. And all of this attention that this energy emergency is paying to leasing on federal lands and doing all the things that are going to make it easier for oil and gas to be developed, there are still, to Josh's point, there are still gas-powered plants. They want to mine more coal, presumably for more coal-fired plants. They're going to produce more power to go somewhere, but they haven't addressed this transmission issue, which is really it's the linchpin here that's going to determine whether or not we're successful in any sort of energy emergency response. And so that is, I think, we tried to talk about it during the Biden years. There was marginal improvements in the Manchin-Barrasso bill. I think, if we are serious about permanent reform, and I think the Democrats now are in a place where they're willing to talk about it more, particularly to enable, I mean, similar to what I raised earlier about, Congress having an energy policy that advantages all. There seems to be more willingness because clearly what they're doing now is not in line with the Democrats' priorities. And Republicans have always been trying to do some streamlining work here. So there might be an opportunity for a meeting of the minds once we get over this initial reconciliation morass that we're in, to actually legislate something that's beneficial. Because I think everyone has at least come to the realization that more needs to be, this tinkering around the edges is not getting us where we need to be in the time that we need to get there.
Yeah, absolutely. Josh?
And I'll make two quick points in conclusion. I think they build on what Eric was saying, but again, the system is in the process of being leveled to the ground. There is this opportunity to build back better. I know that's a sort of a loaded term, but let's just own it here. When we do that, I think we need to center, the first point I'll make is I think we need to center feasibility and cost in our sort of orientation of how we permit clean energy. I'm speaking really here to clean energy advocates, both in the private and nonprofit and public sector. We need to decide that a certain category of projects is good because they add to the grid, they help, with grid reliability, and they help us decarbonize. And stop making support for them these projects contingent on layering just all these requirements that jeopardize feasibility and cost. That's not to say that there isn't space for mitigations and that these values, ensuring equity and inclusivity, aren't important values. But again, with the trade-offs, if solar and wind are good, then let's treat them as such. The second thing is just looking at it from the perspective of the companies and the lenders who are going to provide the capital to make this happen. These aren't public projects; these are private projects, by and large. We're going to have a real uphill battle to bring investment back into this country, and so we have to be thinking in terms of how do we create a regulatory environment that encourages people to give the U.S. another shot.
Yeah.
Because especially, sort of overseas capital that we do want to invest. I mean, we want to create American energy with American jobs, but capital is global. And to bring capital back to the U.S. for clean energy, or frankly, any kind of energy, is going to require a sort of recommittal to regulatory certainty. And I think those two things, the sort of the imperative to, attract capital and create that regulatory certainty, and the need to center project feasibility and costs, I think if we keep those as our North Stars, we can have a really, good, wide-ranging discussion over the next 3.5 years that doesn't sort of go off the rails and bring us back to the bad place where we came.
And I think it's really interesting too, because obviously we're increasing demand and bringing more onto an aging grid that's largely past its useful life already. So lots of things don't add up, and it just feels like something's going to come to a head and kind of have to drive this thing a little further, faster. I don't know if that's going to be like a large scale blackout like we saw in Spain. I don't want any of this to happen, but almost kind of feels like it's going to take a real national emergency to get this thing to speed up faster. I think everything we spoke about today is accurate. I think it's very, very important things to focus on. But I wonder if you have any last thoughts now, because the largest demographic who watches this show is largely young people, people in undergrad, grad school, around the world, interested in climate change, renewables development, and affecting these projects. If you could speak to them directly and possibly have any references for them to check out.
I think don't lose hope. We are in a difficult time now, obviously, but there is, our systems are strong. We definitely need to revisit them, and we need new ideas. I think probably what has hindered us most is so much of, whether you call it the establishment or the well tenured career staff at the agencies who, we are losing in record numbers, and that is going to create its own problem. But the only silver lining that we might have here is that there's room for new ideas that challenge the status quo, that they're not beholden to a long history of inertia in change around the policy movement. And I think that, as people are thinking about where opportunity exists, it is in the policy space. This whole conversation was like, well, how do we do this better? How do we fix this? And we have ideas, but others are going to have more new and different ideas that are completely beyond what I would have thought of, because I'm definitely hindered by my kind of experience bias in this space. But now that we have torn it all down and we have to rebuild it, like what does permitting look like that's effective, that factors into these trade-offs, that centers feasibility and cost effectiveness and all of these things that we could create almost from whole cloth, learning from the previous examples, but like what does our ideal look like? And I think for the young people who are listening, like that, this is an opportunity to really inform and influence the future of policy and permitting in this space, because we're going to have to start over. We're going to have to do this. Your voice is as valuable as anyone else's. And so I encourage you to engage and share your perspectives.
Yeah, I second all of that. I would say more specifically, like get out there and learn, take the next couple of years to learn the law around, all the statutes and at the federal and state level, and sort of how things have worked, and study, countries and states that have done it well. We don't need to read, we are in a sense reinventing the wheel, but there are examples out there of permitting processes that work. I think getting out there and learning how the energy industry works, and how renewables developers sort of look at their balance sheet and decide where and when to build projects, because yes, we need things like tax credits to sort of shape the market, but ultimately, like, these projects need to be good projects, need to be profitable. And so learning how businesses work can inform how we can get systems that get these projects, can encourage these projects to be built. Read Ezra Klein and Derek Thompson's Abundance, Mark Dunkelman's Why Nothing Works. There's some real sort of very recent, but like, I think sort of instant canon books on this, from people far, sort of with higher profiles than us, and far, in some respects, way smarter than us. They're not the only, the last word on it, but I think they provide a really nice framing of how we should be thinking about these issues.
Absolutely, I agree with that. Well, we're coming up on the hour now, so again, I wanted to thank you both. I enjoyed this chat. I frankly enjoy every episode I do, because it ends up feeling like a TED Talk on these topics. So I got a little smarter today. So thank you guys for that. And for everyone listening today, we're putting a lot of challenges in front of you and speaking a lot about problems, but I try really hard to end each episode on a hopeful note, and hopefully drive some of you to take actionable steps, because these problems aren't going to go anywhere unless people are willing to step forward and put their thoughts and their ideas forward. And as Eric said before, don't be afraid to challenge the status quo, because that's how positive change happens. So I just want to leave us on that. And if everyone listening, have a nice day.
Thank you.